The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Introducing Sine Institute Fellow 2022, Richard Fontaine.
All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first session in a series on national security at the Sine Institute at American University. I'm Richard Fontaine, a 2022 Sine Institute Fellow, and when I'm not plugging in virtually to American University, also the Chief Executive Officer of the Center for a New American Security, CNAS. The seminar series is titled Crafting National Security for Today and Tomorrow, and is focused on the chief forces that are driving today's world and how we should respond to them. Over 6 sessions, the series will bring together expert guest speakers to discuss the issues that are the forefront of policymaker minds. We'll look at China, technology, Afghanistan, the US government, and other things. And the conversations together will highlight a huge array of national security challenges and the debate about how Washington and others should deal with them. Our first session is going to focus on Afghanistan, which of course has been the scene of dramatic change over the past months. It's hard to believe that it's only been about 6 months since the Ghani government was ensconced in Kabul and debates continued over America's military role in the country, and a Taliban victory was predicted by many to be months, if not years off, if even then. Now, of course, the Taliban rules Afghanistan. The US and other foreign militaries have withdrawn. Tens of thousands of Afghans have fled the country, including during the dramatic evacuation that filled everyone's television screens for weeks. And America's longest war is over. Or it may not actually be over. It's tempting to say that the chapter on Afghanistan is closed, but multiple challenges remain, from Al-Qaeda and ISIS to a looming humanitarian catastrophe, to the 800,000 American service members who served in Afghanistan over some 20 years. To discuss these matters, I am really pleased to have as my guest today, Lisa Curtis. Lisa is a senior fellow and director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. She previously served as Deputy Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for South and Central Asia. And she worked on South Asia issues at the State Department, the CIA, on the staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and elsewhere. In her position on the NSC staff, she was very involved in Afghan policymaking and participated extensively in the negotiations with the Taliban. So I will kick off the conversation with Lisa, and I have plenty of questions for her, but if those of you tuning in have questions, put them in the Q&A box and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So Lisa, welcome. And in this conversation, we'll go back and look at a number of policy questions, but I thought I might start with where things are today in Afghanistan. What is the situation, and should the United States care much one way or the other about what happens in that country now that we're out?
Well, thank you, Richard, and it's great to be here with everybody. Thanks for attending. I think that, Afghanistan is still important for the United States. As President Biden has said, he wanted to shift attention to the Indo-Pacific and China, which is part of the reason he decided to withdraw all US forces from Afghanistan. But the fact of the matter is the United States still has vital national security interests in Afghanistan, mainly around the terrorism issue. And there are concerns that the terrorism threat could reemerge in Afghanistan. Well, it hasn't really gone away. It's sort of shifted in focus right now. ISIS-K is a major concern. They have increased their attacks in Afghanistan since the Taliban took power, but also Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is still there. They've been lying low, but the fact is the Taliban are still close to Al-Qaeda. They still have linkages with each other. And so the assessment is that Al-Qaeda will now take this opportunity now that it has fellow Islamist radicals in power in Afghanistan, it will take this opportunity to rebuild its base in Afghanistan. So we simply can't take our eyes off Afghanistan. We must remain engaged. We saw what happened when we ignored Afghanistan in the 1990s, basically led to the path that led to the 9/11 attacks. We also must remain engaged to try to protect as many gains as possible that were made in Afghanistan for the Afghan people. We did see girls going to school, women involved in the social, economic, political life of the country. We saw enhanced human rights in the country. And we have to try to preserve as many of those gains as possible. We owe it to the Afghan people. We owe it to our own investment. We have invested blood and treasure in this country over the last 20 years. And so we owe it to the country and our own investments to maintain as many of those gains as possible. Right now, the current situation is that the Taliban have consolidated power. We see that the hardliners are in ascendance. 4 of the cabinet members, for example, that are part of the interim cabinet in Afghanistan are members of the Haqqani network. This is a brutal, designated terrorist organization responsible for some of the worst attacks in Afghanistan during the last 20 years. Sirajuddin Haqqani, the leader of the Haqqani network, is now the interior minister in Afghanistan. It doesn't get worse than that. So unfortunately, the stage is set for the reemergence of a terrorist safe haven. And we also see women's rights going backwards. The Taliban had said some of the right things when they initially came to power. However, we've seen them backtrack, and women are not being allowed to work in many sectors. Girls are not being allowed to attend high school, secondary school. So they simply have not lived up to some of those initial pledges that they had made. So the situation is very concerning, and the U.S. must remain engaged.
Yeah, let me ask you about how we do that. So right now, there's a pretty terrible humanitarian situation on the ground. There's reports of people starving. It's the winter time in a cold place, and the withdrawal of all of the, or almost all of the international aid, whether from governments or NGOs, in a stroke, which was supporting about half of the economy or something like this, together with the freezing of the government's assets abroad and things like that, put the country, but maybe also us, in something of a dilemma. On the one hand, we don't want to see Afghans suffer. These are the people that we fought to, among other things, help for so long. On the other hand, what do you do with a government that is, as you said, got terrorists associated with it or part of it? We don't want money to go to them that otherwise wouldn't, and things like that. So how do we deal with the humanitarian issue on the one hand and the dealing with the Taliban on the other?
Well, of course, the humanitarian situation has to be our top priority. We have to make sure that the basic needs of the Afghan people are met: food, shelter, healthcare. As you said, 75% of the Afghan budget relied on international assistance, and that abruptly ended when the Taliban took power. Now, the U.S. has been providing humanitarian assistance in Afghanistan. In fact, the U.S. Has provided more humanitarian assistance since August than any other country. We've committed $700 million in humanitarian assistance over the last 6 months. There are some people calling for the unfreezing of the assets. The U.S. froze $7 billion in assets in the United States. There's another $2 to $3 billion in Europe. But frankly, I don't think that's the solution. I think if we are to unconditionally release those assets to the Taliban interim government, we're jeopardizing an opportunity to be able to try to shape the policies of the Taliban toward the people of Afghanistan, as well as on the terrorism issue. And, we simply can't hand over funding to a government that includes designated terrorists, people with U.S. blood on their hands. That would actually put in danger U.S. citizens throughout the globe. So I don't think just simply releasing those assets to the Taliban government is the answer. However, there may be ways to be able to provide at least some of those assets to humanitarian organizations so that the aid can go directly to the Afghan people. We are seeing the UN has been able to get money into the system to try to pay healthcare workers salaries, even some of the education sector through UN agencies. So some of this is happening. It needs to be brought to scale. There needs to be a more sustainable way to get money into the system, to get liquidity into the system. But we need to do that in a way where we at least seek to avoid this money going into the hands of terrorists. It's not easy, but I think it's possible. I don't think it's a situation where we have to cut off all assistance. Obviously, we can't do that. We have to get the assistance into the Afghan people, but we also need to be careful in how we provide that assistance. And there are different ideas coming up. One that I would support would be to allow the World Bank Afghan Reconstruction Trust Fund, which has been in existence since 2002, but of course was halted when the Taliban took power, allow that to revive itself and allow that to be sort of a channel for the international community to put their funding through this mechanism, because we already have the monitoring, financial monitoring mechanisms in place. The money's going to local community development councils. So you can get at least most of the money directly into the local communities and bypass to a large degree the Taliban. So that's one idea that's out there. Another, which has actually come from one of a CNAS adjunct fellow, Alex Zerdin, who previously worked for the U.S. Treasury Department, is to allow a private Afghan bank to take on the functions of a central bank, to sort of act as a carve out. So that's another way to get liquidity into the system. Now, some people say, well, if it's an Afghan bank located in Afghanistan, of course, it's going to come under pressure from the Taliban. And, that's true. We would have to think about ways to mitigate that from happening. So there's no perfect solution, but there are definitely creative solutions out there that people are working on. And this must be the top priority for the United States, is finding those solutions, working with the international community, letting those on the ground lead the conversation, the NGOs that are still there, that are still working, as well as the UN, which is still operating in the country.
I want to go back to something you said about women's rights and girls' rights and education, and broaden it a little bit. The Taliban leading up to their takeover, and then since then have been at pains to say, we've changed. We're not the Taliban of 2001. That was a regime that preferred to see its destruction to handing over Osama bin Laden after the 9/11 attacks, and would hang people from lampposts and have mass executions in soccer stadiums and all the things we've heard about. What do you make of the Taliban today versus the Taliban that we knew about and read about and heard about for 20 years? And you've spent a lot of hours with their negotiators in Doha in the course of the peace agreement. What was it like to, sit across from these guys who, essentially the enemy of the United States, that had a very, very different view about what good looks like in Afghanistan, and try to deal with them?
There are definitely shades and differences among the different Taliban leaders. My understanding is there are actually differences within the Taliban as we speak on how they're going to move forward on issues like women's rights, women's education, that are still being worked out. So to the degree that the US can try to work with those Taliban leaders who would support women's education and making some of these changes, I think we've got to try to do that. The problem is, like I said at the outset, unfortunately, right now, it looks like the hardliners are in ascendance. And it looks like rather than those who negotiated the agreement with the United States, people like Mullah Baradar, they have been sort of relegated to the second tier. And it's more the hardliners, the people that were directing the military operations from their safe haven in Afghanistan. These people have been given the top positions. And as I indicated, the Haqqani network, who is supported by Pakistan, has very close ties to Pakistan's intelligence service. They have been given important, powerful positions. So, it's the things are trending in the wrong direction in terms of seeing those Taliban leaders who might have a more moderate approach to governing. They're just not in the powerful positions right now at this moment. One thing that people are looking for is the Taliban have said they're going to reopen all girls schools in March. So people are watching very closely to see if this actually happens. Are they going to open secondary schools to girls? Are they going to allow women to attend university classes? Right now, the Minister for Higher Education is also a Haqqani leader. It's not a person who you would expect to have providing opportunities to women and girls at the top of his priority list. So, things are trending in the wrong direction, but we still need to remain engaged and try to do what we can to impact the Taliban's policies moving forward. And I think seeing how they handle the girls' education issue in March will be a big bellwether in terms of, who's up, who's down. Are they going to move forward in new ways, or are they basically going to revert to the Taliban 1.0 that we saw in the late 1990s?
I'm going to take you back a little bit and think about some of the policy questions that have gotten us to where we are over the years. So, if you had said in November of 2001, after the Taliban fell so rapidly that, 20 years later, the US would spend something on the order of $2 trillion, 800,000 troops deployed, organize this major international effort, and the Taliban would have no air force, numbers smaller than the government forces, and yet at the end of that whole thing, it would be the Americans that withdrew from the country, and the Taliban took over a greater percentage of the country than they actually held at the height of their power in 2001. I think people, probably even the Taliban, would have said that's crazy. But of course, here we are. So, how did America lose its longest war?
Yeah, I've written extensively on the mistakes I believe that the U.S. made in talks with the Taliban. I wrote an article in the fall in Foreign Affairs. I wrote something for the Hoover Institute on how the Doha Agreement guaranteed U.S. failure in Afghanistan. So I have talked quite extensively about our failure to gain more concessions from the Taliban, and the fact that the Doha deal actually undermined the Afghan government. It destroyed the morale of the Afghan security forces, and it did contribute to the rapid way the Taliban was able to take control of the country this past summer. But the problems in Afghanistan span 4 different administrations, 2 Republican, 2 Democratic. And so I think it's important that this Afghanistan commission that has been designated by the National Defense Authorization Act of 2022 is very important. The Congress is in the process right now of standing up that commission. I think it's going to be made up of 25 to 26 people. They're going to look at the totality of the war, all 20 years, and come up with recommendations. First, identify the mistakes, how we can avoid similar mistakes in the future. And they're going to be at this for 4 years. They'll be putting out periodic reports, but I think this is something that's extremely important. How could we have invested so much money, so much blood and treasure into trying to prevent the Taliban from coming back into power, and yet they were able to do so easily? And I think what we'll find is mistakes, across the U.S. government. But I think, having worked at the National Security Council for nearly 4 years, one of the major mistakes, I think, is not, having a interagency process, having a strategy that one could commit to for a period of time and allow that to move forward. People talk about we had 20 different strategies over 20 years, and I think there's some truth to that. I think that our interagency coordination has a lot to be desired, and I think the commission will be, I believe, one of their major findings when they really dive into this and look closely at what could the U.S. have done differently, what were the mistakes that were made. And it's really important that this process is bipartisan, nonpartisan, bipartisan, whatever you want to say. If either party tries to use the Afghanistan issue just to batter the other side, right? We're not going to learn anything. We're, as a country, we're going to lose, because we'll make the same mistakes moving forward in the next conflict. So it's very important that this remains a serious effort, serious bipartisan effort, to really understand how things could have gone so wrong in Afghanistan that we sit here today with the Taliban in power.
I think that's such a good point, because for that commission, one could easily see Democrats coming in and saying, well, really all this started when Bush took his eyes off Afghanistan and decided to invade Iraq and redeployed resources from Afghanistan to Iraq. The Republicans coming in and say, well, Obama surged troops in Afghanistan, but he simultaneously put a deadline on their withdrawal and tipped off the Taliban. They could just wait out that effort. And then, the Democrats coming back and say, well, it was the Trump administration got us in this peace agreement. And Republicans coming back and saying, well, it was the Biden administration that fulfilled it. And I mean, that's unproductive. I mean, failure is going to have 1,000 fathers and mothers here, and to be able to draw some lessons that can improve the way we do things in the future seems to me pretty vital. One of the things you haven't mentioned so far, but is often talked about, is the role of Pakistan in all of this. And some people will even submit that the Taliban was never going to be defeated so long as it had safe haven and support in Pakistan, which it did. So what role has Pakistan played throughout this 20-year span, and what could the U.S. have done differently, if anything, with respect to Pakistan?
Well, that's a great question, Richard. And you're right. Part of this, we're sitting here beating up ourselves about the fact that the Taliban was able to come roaring back to power. But you're right. Part of the reason, a large part of the reason, is because they had sanctuary inside Pakistan for the last 20 years and support and operational guidance and help getting across the border and medical attention. They were able to cross at will back and forth between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Without that sanctuary, it's unlikely they would have been able to come back to power in the way that they did this past summer. And you're right, we need to remember that. Now, why did we fail to ever get this part of the policy functioning properly? That definitely is a question the commission will have to examine. I will say that the Trump administration did cut military assistance to Pakistan in January 2018. But unfortunately, this did not change Pakistan's policies. I think what we have learned is Pakistan is committed to its policies of support for the Taliban, and it sees Afghanistan very narrowly through its lens of wanting to keep India out. So anything that Pakistan does in Afghanistan is seen through that lens of India. And that's why the US and Pakistan have fundamentally different goals in Afghanistan. So I guess moving forward, I would hope that people remember this and that they don't fall under that familiar trap of, oh, Pakistan's our partner, and oh, we can work with Pakistan. Because frankly, Pakistan has different objectives, different counterterrorism objectives than we do in Afghanistan. And, I'm not saying that we need to designate Pakistan as state sponsor of terrorism or slap more sanctions on them. I'm not saying that. I simply think that we need to be realistic when we think about what's possible with Pakistan and not try to kid ourselves and think that now that the Taliban's in power, somehow we can work with Pakistan on mutual goals. We may be able to work together against ISIS-K or the TTP, but we've got to accept that Pakistan's never going to change its policies on the Haqqani network, who are closely allied with Al-Qaeda. And so I think once we are more realistic and recognize what we can do with Pakistan and what we can't, we're going to be better off. And I've been arguing that we need to look more towards Central Asia. We need to look toward countries like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan. Right now, I think these countries would not welcome sort of US troops on the ground because of Russia's influence, of course, but they probably would welcome increased intelligence sharing. Perhaps even in the future, we could base some CT assets out of the country. So we should look toward the Central Asian states as partners in Afghanistan moving forward.
Just to stay on Pakistan for a second, do you think it's fair to say that at least for a number of years, one of the reasons why the United States wasn't able to move Pakistan off of its support and sanctuary for the Taliban is because we had other objectives with Pakistan? I mean, for quite a while, it was Al-Qaeda first, and Pakistan was actually working with the United States in some key ways. In fact, continues to work with shared enemies, just not our enemy, and if it's the same group as they support, and including Taliban on the Pakistani side of the border that might be a threat to the government of Islamabad. We also wanted supply lines through the port of Karachi up to the Khyber Pass to our troops in Afghanistan that had to be supplied in that landlocked country. We didn't want them to carry out 2008 Mumbai style attacks again, and we were worried about nuclear security. So it's never been one issue of the Taliban that we could go to the Pakistanis and say, this is what we expect, or this is what we want. But rather it's been a pretty complicated sort of relationship with the top objective in our minds shifting from time to time. Is that a fair summation of this complicated course of US-Pakistan relations?
I think that is. I think we definitely have had many different objectives that we wanted to achieve in Pakistan, and the fact that it's a nuclear weapons state, they have nuclear weapons. Technically, it's not a nuclear weapons state, but you know what I mean. They have a nuclear weapons capability. That complicates the issues. They have historically very close relations with China. That makes it more complicated. We certainly want to prevent any conflict from breaking out between India and Pakistan. So that issue often trumps the situation. So you're right that it's a complicated picture. But I also think sometimes, we are our own worst enemy when we have amnesia. We forget some of these facts, and we try to delude ourselves, or we have wishful thinking. Americans are generally very positive, and we want to think that anything's possible. So I think that's part of the problem as well. I think we continually overestimate our ability to convince the Pakistanis to do the right thing. I personally probably even have been guilty of that. So I think we need to overcome our own, optimism or belief that, somehow we can convince the Pakistanis. They're, charming diplomats. Our military leaders, often are able to relate to Pakistan's military leaders on a personal level. But we need to just remember, I think, what's happened over the last 20 years. That's the best thing we can do, is just not forget what Pakistan, the policies Pakistan has pursued over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think there's two broader points in what you're saying that are instructive, particularly for the students who are listening and imagining a diplomatic or policy-making career. I mean, one is this issue of multiple objectives and priorities. I mean, in any bilateral relationship, the government that you're talking to will listen very intently what you say is most important. And they'll listen closely, but not as closely to number two. But number three, you're starting to lose them. And 4 and 5 and 6 is just kind of on the list usually to say it. I mean, that's a broad statement, but you have to think pretty hard about what you want the most. And when it turns out that the thing you didn't want the most, or at least you didn't tell the other side what you wanted the most, turned out to be the most important, then you've gotten yourself into a little bit of trouble. So that's one point. The other is, you sort of touched on this, but you and I can remember for years there was this desire to, quote, change Pakistan's strategic outlook. It wasn't going to use some form of engagement or diplomacy or carrots and sticks to change the way they respond to particular incentives, which could have been reasonable, but it was to have a wholesale change of their strategic outlook. They would go from seeing India not as a threat, but rather as a potential partner economically and otherwise. They would see the Taliban not as a potential partner, but rather as a threat to their own integrity as a country and things like that. And so much of the aid packages and the diplomacy and the speeches and the persuasion and the engagements were sort of aimed to bolster this, flip the way you think about the world and your neighborhood. And of course, that never happened. At the time, it looked pretty unlikely that it would ever happen. But it's pretty damn hard to tell the leaders of another country that you know far better than they do what is in their interests, and that they should abandon the way they've thought about those interests for decades, which is a very different matter than trying to elicit different kinds of policies or behavior based on some combination of incentives and engagement and persuasion and things like that. So I think it's just, H.R. McMaster has this idea of, I think, strategic empathy, or, sort of understanding.
Narcissism.
Strategic narcissism. Okay, so strategic narcissism. I think the answer is some strategic empathy. Understand the other side and don't put yourself in the role of saying, well, if I was running Pakistan, I would see and do this. Well, of course you would, but you're not. So it doesn't really matter. The point is, is about to understand.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Richard, on all points. Very, very well taken. But honestly, as a longtime watcher of Pakistan and, observing what would be better for Pakistan, I mean, it's actually not good for Pakistan to be supporting Islamic radicals. And we've seen it backfire in the form of the TTP, which came up in 2007. So, it's hard to watch a country do things that are not good for its own people. So I think that's part of the challenge as well, that that's right. It would be so much more efficacious for the Pakistani people if Pakistan developed other ways to assert its regional objectives rather than support Islamist radicals, right? But when parts of the country, namely the intelligence service and the military, believe otherwise, you're right. You're not going to convince them, even when it's in the best interest of their own country and their own people.
Yeah. There is a question that has come in from Chaitanya, an SIS student in Washington, D.C. Question is, how do countries balance the need to provide humanitarian support and hold the Taliban accountable for their policies or regression on human rights? In a sense, should the Afghan people be punished for the Taliban's policies, especially since they're not democratically elected? And the US has been responsible for supporting some vulnerable groups for so long. So this is sort of, you touched on this before, but how do you avoid having the Afghan people sort of punished twice, I guess, once they live under the Taliban, and two, because they live under the Taliban, they're being denied the international assistance that would otherwise be available, but at the same time, you want to keep at arm's length, terrorist elements and things like that. So, you described a few of the mechanisms by which we might do that, but I think maybe you could speak for a minute just about the principle behind all of this, because sometimes there is this narrative. Well, Americans talk a good game, and when it's in their interests, they'll spend money or do whatever it is, but they don't really care about people. They don't, So once they're out, they're out. This is not really about the human side of things. They don't really care about these folks. But it's just some sort of hidden craven security or economic interest. So maybe you could talk about the principle, and also maybe, if you don't mind, talk a little bit about some of the Afghans who have been evacuated to the United States and have begun their new lives since August.
Well, thank you for that question. It's a great question, and it's one that we're looking at CNAS and trying to figure out the best way forward. How do you support the Afghan people, support the civil society, but not legitimize a government that has come to power not through elections but through military force, and whose policies are not helpful to the Afghan people, particularly women and girls. So I think that this is a question that we'll be seeking to answer, and in fact we have a major report coming out on Thursday that will deal with many of these issues. And you talk about the cynicism of American foreign policy or national security. There may be something to that, but in the case of Afghanistan, I think it's different. I think that so many people have served over there, some 800,000 forces, so many diplomats, aid workers, being in a country 20 years in this nature, you really develop some very close linkages between the American people and the Afghan people. And we have seen this in really the horror that US veterans who had served in Afghanistan, what they felt watching the chaotic evacuations. There's been some polling on this and just how disappointed our veterans were with the chaotic evacuation. Even if they supported the idea of the US withdrawing all its troops, they didn't like the way it was handled and managed. And there's also been polling that veterans, they've been helping in this effort to extract Afghans whose lives are in danger, maybe former security forces or people that are committed to human rights who worked for the previous government. They're helping these Afghans get to safety. They're using their own money, their own resources and time on these private efforts to try to get Afghans out and get them safely to the US and then to resettle them, help them resettle here in the United States. It's really incredible to see the outpouring of support from our veterans community for Afghan partners. But what we do need to see is our own US government also committed to this effort and working closely with these private organizations. And, hopefully we'll see the State Department continuing its efforts to get Afghan allies out, people who are eligible to apply for resettlement in the United States, and remain committed to those efforts, because there are questions about how committed the US government is to these efforts. Are we seeing more effort expended by the private organizations? Because, we need to see the US government, there are diplomatic things that need to happen that only our diplomats can do, like resettling and or temporarily moving to third countries while they pursue resettlement. We need help from the US government and involvement on these issues. So, this is something that, we're also advocating at CNAS for, is to see continued commitment from our diplomats, our US government, in helping Afghans get out and then helping them to get to the United States. And, as Americans, we need to welcome these Afghan refugees with open arms. We need to do our part to help them resettle because, we fought with them for 20 years. The Afghan security forces lost some 60,000 people over the last 20 years. So they did fight for their country, and they also partnered with us in countering terrorism. We would not have been able to make the gains against Al-Qaeda that we made in South Asia without our partnership with the Afghan security forces. So this is something that we have to remember.
Well, and you and I in both Doha a few months ago, where a large number of Afghans were evacuated, and here in the United States have met some unbelievably extraordinary Afghans who all of a sudden got on a plane with their families and sometimes only with the clothes on their backs, not even knowing what country they were going to land in, but to get out of that situation. And there's some really extraordinary people. I mean, they're going to make great Americans, the Afghans here. I'm pretty convinced of that. Let me take you back a little bit to your time.
Richard, if I can just say one more thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
The Afghans who are resettling here, and many in Europe as well, and Canada, and other countries. I think it's important for the US government to remain engaged with the Afghan diaspora. They've got the contacts in the country. They know what's happening on the ground. And in this era where there's restrictions on media, it's getting harder and harder to get information out of Afghanistan, I think it's helpful to rely on the Afghan diaspora community and to help them network with each other. I think this is going to be really important moving forward. I just want to make that point.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And I mean, if we look into our very cloudy crystal ball and there is a better day in Afghanistan with a better government and all this is the brain trust that, was so ably contributing to their society. And some of those folks may wish to do that again in the future, although it seems so unimaginable right now. But I wanted to take you back a little bit to your time working on the National Security Council staff, being involved in the negotiations with the Taliban and the peace agreement. So, if you sort of roll the tape forward, the Taliban take over as the United States, clear the United States is withdrawing all of its troops and leaving none. President Biden said, well, he really had no choice because he inherited a peace agreement that required the withdrawal of all American troops in exchange for the Taliban not attacking those troops. And he was able to sort of get a modest extension, but had he upended that agreement, then the Taliban would have resumed its attacks and we would have been right back in the middle of the war. Leaving the President Biden's sort of interpretation of that aside for a second, what was the thinking at the time the peace agreement was being negotiated and signed from the American side? Where did we, presumably, I'm speculating here, but in the minds of the people involved and President Trump and others and Mike Pompeo, if you fast forwarded to now, it would be a different picture than what has arrived on our doorstep in Afghanistan. So what was this aimed at? What did people think was achievable? Why was this a good idea?
Well, I've written about this, and I think there's some wishful thinking happening that that the Taliban were the Taliban we wish they were rather than who they really are. So there was always some optimism. They'll negotiate. There'll be a peace process. So I think there was some lack of clear-headed thinking and assessment based on data, facts on the ground. There was a lack of that, and rather a propensity to sort of rely on what you hoped would be the case. And so I think that was problematic. And, I think that the agreement itself, and I've written about this as well, was pretty weak. It really did not demand that the Taliban break ties with al-Qaeda. It simply demanded that the Taliban not allow al-Qaeda to plot, plan, and train for attacks against the United States and its allies from Afghanistan. The problem with that is, say al-Qaeda did conduct an attack from Afghanistan, the Taliban could simply claim, well, we didn't know, we didn't realize they were planning this. Sorry, sort of the same thing they did after the 9/11 attacks, not really taking responsibility for what happens within their purview. So I think, what we should have done is gotten a commitment for the Taliban to make a clean break with al-Qaeda, to eject al-Qaeda from Afghanistan. Now, some people say, oh, we couldn't have gotten that. We never could have gotten that. I beg to differ. I think that we needed to drive a harder bargain. Admittedly, to do that, we would have needed to maintain some troops in Afghanistan. So I think, if we wanted to really see a genuine peace process, then we needed to be able to maintain some leverage in the country. And when it became clear that, when President Biden basically said he wanted to withdraw all troops in April, it should have been clear that we had lost our leverage, and we should have shifted to a plan B rather than just focusing on the Doha agreement. I think we should have more closely negotiated the withdrawal with the Ghani government. And frankly, we should have done that from the get-go. I think if the analysts would have really done their homework, looked clear, in a clear-headed way at what was happening, there would have been a realization that, the Taliban is not going to play ball. They're not going to get involved in a genuine peace process. So perhaps another way to do this is to withdraw gradually, but in close consultation with the government.
I'm gonna, in our remaining 10 minutes or so, I'm gonna ask you a couple of questions that have really not much to do with what policy should be, but rather about what your experience was like in government and things like that. And if some of the students or anyone else has anything they'd like to ask, just pop it into the Q&A. So when you spent 4 years at the NSC, Senior Director for South and Central Asia, there was no confirmed Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia for any of those 4 years, if I'm correct. And so you were the person. What was an average day like in the White House during the Trump administration working on these issues?
Well, let me just say at the outset that even though we didn't have a confirmed Assistant Secretary for South and Central Asia, we had extremely competent acting Assistant Secretary, Alice Wells.
That is true.
Who did a phenomenal job as acting Assistant Secretary and was every bit as active and engaged and pushing policies and had a great staff as well. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, we won't leave Ambassador Wells out. So apologies, Alice, if you're listening to this, but anyway.
No, even if she's not, I think it bears,
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Worth saying. It's worth saying. So, yeah, look, I think that, there were some shortcomings in the policy process on Afghanistan once the peace talks began. And I think that, that our policy suffered because of that. I think that, that's why we have the NSC-led policy process in order to, bring all of the ideas across the U.S. government on the table to discuss them fully, tee up decisions for the next level. So as you know, the Policy Coordinating Committee, which is what it was called when I was at the NSC, the senior director leads that, brings the different government agencies together. They hash out and decide what issues need to be decided at the next level. So then it's taken to the deputies level, then to the principals, then if need be to the president. All of these meetings happened when General McMaster was National Security Advisor. We had a very thorough policy process, which led to the South Asia strategy that was announced by President Trump in August 2017. Unfortunately, President Trump was not happy with the direction things were going in Afghanistan and became very anxious to withdraw troops, around the same time that General McMaster left as the National Security Advisor. So I think it's really important to have that NSC-led policy process on all issues. It serves a very important purpose, and it allows the experts throughout the U.S. government to have their say and to make sure that the best options are teed up for the leadership, and that there is a process in choosing those options. So that's what I would say about the process. And I think that there were many accomplishments during the Trump administration, particularly the U.S.-India relationship. There was a marked elevation in ties between the U.S. and India. The Quad, the revival of the Quad dialogue between India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. It had laid dormant for 10 years. It was revived in 2017. The Biden administration has taken it to the next level and not only maintained the momentum, but probably even taken it further. So, there were good policy processes in place on various issues. Unfortunately, Afghanistan wasn't one of them.
Okay, two more questions. Well, there's several more questions. One is, what experiences as a student can I try to engage in now to get international experience to supplement my post-graduation career path? And maybe you can also answer what the future of diplomacy is in a world where we get to do stuff like this and don't even have to leave our house. All I had to do is move my kid's teddy bear out of the frame. Do we need old-fashioned diplomacy where you sit down with people, or is it all tech equipped and tech enabled?
Oh yeah, nothing can replace the face-to-face meeting. Unfortunately, that's just been one of the hits that we've taken with the pandemic. I think we've found ways to get around it, and we're all sitting in front of Zoom for many hours, but I think we all look forward to the day where we can sit down face to face and hold meetings again. In terms of I think the question was how to prepare now for a career in policy. Well, I think the fact that you're on this call right now is wonderful. And you're obviously at a university that has one of the best programs in foreign policy, national security, and you're in Washington, D.C. So you have endless access to think tank discussions, to policymakers giving speeches, giving talks throughout the city. So you really have an enormous opportunity that you can sort of constantly be engaged in U.S. policy discussions if you're in Washington, D.C. I think internships are wonderful. I know it's hard. Sometimes they don't pay. But I will mention that CNAS, we do pay our interns. But I think internships are really important to get that hands-on experience, because you really don't know what it's like to do something until you're actually there doing it. So would encourage you to look for internships, whether it's on the Hill, whether it's for a think tank, whether it's for an NGO, whether it's at the White House or State Department, DOD. There's just endless opportunities for getting that experience. And even if, you take a cut and pay for, a year or so, I think it's well worth it to get that experience under your belt. So yeah, I think in, foreign policy, it's always good to have a language and to think about an area that you have a particular interest in, where you might want to develop a specialty. I think, you can go both ways. You can be sort of a generalist, but I think it does pay if you really want to say, work at the NSC or work at State Department on a particular issue set, develop your expertise, do those studies, learn that language, become, somebody who knows everything about that particular issue or topic. I think that's important.
One thing I would just add to all of that very good advice is, if you don't already know how to do it, learn to write well. Because in this business, the written word is prized to a degree that unless you've worked in it, you will never believe. Everything is paper moving back and forth. It's memos, it's statements, it's, in outside of government, in the think tank world, you're trying to influence policy largely through the written word. And the ability to convey what you are trying to convey clearly and persuasively in fluently is a huge difference. And it means that you'll have opportunities at a younger age than people who just sort of bumble along and, that's the fourth or fifth thing that they think about. So, yeah.
And just remember, maybe some writers are born, but it really is a skill. It's a skill that you have to develop, you have to work on. You have to get training, you have to take other people's advice, not get too wedded to your own way of writing. So I think Richard is absolutely right. And just remember that, learning to write well is hard work and it takes time.
Okay, last question for you. This is from the audience here. What are you most proud of from your time in government?
I would say that the Quad, reviving the Quad discussion, because when I was out of government at the Heritage Foundation previously, we had done a track 2 Quad dialogue for a few years. And the idea was that we were sort of looking at the issues and, you know, what the countries could cooperate on once they were ready for that official dialogue. So to be able to then go into government and be part of that reviving of the Quad dialogue was really very exciting and gratifying. So yeah, and then to see the Biden administration carrying it forward, you know, good policy being maintained, you know, through change of administration is something that yeah, I think that's something that I'm proud of.
Yeah, I know the Quad revival has been an amazing thing, and to see how far it's gone and how fast is just remarkable. Well, Lisa, you've done us all a great service. Thank you for joining us. This was fantastic and a fantastic kickoff to this seminar series on national security issues. The next one will be a week from today, so it'll be at 4 o'clock on January 25th. We'll have Elizabeth Economy, who is a fellow at the Hoover Institute, has recently written a book on China's approach to the world. She's a China specialist and is working also as a senior advisor for China to the Secretary of Commerce. So that should be great. But in the meantime, thanks to everybody for tuning in. And Lisa, thank you again. This was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Bye.